The billionaire invited his ugly secretary to the party as a joke. His friends were laughing before she even arrived, but Betty Gibbies heard everything behind the door. Bet how long it takes her to realize it's a joke. Imagine her getting all dressed up. She'll look even more pathetic. Heartbroken, she ran home crying, but she made a promise. They'll never laugh at me again. Betty then walked into the party, stunning, transformed, unrecognizable. The entire ballroom stopped to look at her. Jaden Schultz choked on his champagne, and Betty smiled, remembering her own words. I'll look gorgeous and make them all eat their words. Her mission was underway. What she didn't expect, someone was ready to sabotage her at the party.
Hey, everyone. My name is Rowan, and I'm the creator of this channel. And today, I have something to tell you. Many of the stories I share here on the channel are inspired by the ones you tell me. If you have a story to share and would like to see it in a video, send me an email. It's down in the description below. And now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen someone called ugly become the most beautiful person at their workplace? Let me know in the comments below.
Chapter 1. The Cruel Joke and the Promise.
But tonight is the last time anyone laughs at me.
Betty Gibbies adjusted her thick glasses on her face for the third time that morning as she organized the financial reports on the glass desk in the executive office. The lenses left red marks on the tip of her nose, and she knew that by the end of the day she'd have that familiar headache. But there was no other option because the contact lenses she'd tried to use once had irritated her sensitive eyes in a way that made her give up forever. The 3 years working as an executive secretary at Schultz Enterprises had gone by too fast and at the same time too slow. In a strange contradiction, she couldn't explain even to herself. The salary was good, and the work was challenging in the way she liked. But there was that small, painful detail that had haunted her since high school and now followed her through the mirrored hallways of the 15th floor. Ugly Betty. The nickname had started in school when she was only 12 years old, and the boys laughed at her appearance without any mercy. But at least back then she could hide in the library or pretend she didn't hear the mean whispers. Now, at 26 years old, the nickname had crossed the gates of adolescence and settled into the corporate environment with the same silent, piercing cruelty. The clothes she wore were always too big because she had never learned to choose the right size or the cut that would flatter her body, and her lifeless brown hair fell shapeless to her shoulders because she couldn't. Remember the last time she'd gone to a real salon? It wasn't for lack of money, but rather a strange mix of giving up and fear of trying something new and failing again. Betty, I need the contracts for the Horizon merger by 3 o'clock. Jaden Schultz's voice cut through the office silence like a sharp blade, and she felt that familiar tightness in her chest that she always felt when he spoke to her. Jaden was 34 years old and was everything she wasn't. Tall, elegant, with that navy blue suit that fit perfectly on his athletic body, and a natural confidence that made people turn when he walked into any room. His dark eyes had an intensity that made her look away every time he looked, directly at her. And his deep voice had a tone of command that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed. Of course, Mr. Schultz. They're ready, she answered without looking at him as she grabbed the blue folder from the side drawer of the desk. He approached to take the documents, and for a second their hands almost touched. But Betty pulled hers back so fast that the papers almost fell to the floor. Her heart was beating out of rhythm, and she knew it was pathetic to feel that ridiculous electricity just because he'd gotten too close. But her body didn't understand logic or shame. Good work, he said with that half-smile that she never knew if it was genuine or just automatic politeness. And then he turned his back and returned to his office, leaving a trail of expensive cologne in the air. Betty let out the breath she'd been holding and wondered for the 1000th time why she still felt that flutter in her stomach when he was around, when it was obvious that a man like Jaden Schultz would never look at a woman like her with anything other than professional indifference. The rest of the morning passed in a mechanical routine of emails, calls, and organizing schedules until at 2 in the afternoon, Jaden came out of his office with a different expression on his face, almost excited, and walked to her desk with determined steps. Betty, the company is hosting a charity event next Friday at the Majestic Hotel, and I'd like you to go, he said in a tone too casual to be natural. Her heart jumped so hard that she was sure he'd heard it. The Majestic Hotel was the most elegant place in the city, and she'd never been to anything like that. But the idea of being personally invited by him sent a wave of almost childlike happiness flooding through her chest. "Me? Are you sure?" The words came out before she could filter them, and she felt like an idiot for seeming so surprised. "I am. You work hard and you deserve a night of recognition," he replied with that perfect smile that showed his white, aligned teeth. And then he turned and went back to his office without waiting for a more elaborate response. Betty sat there, staring at the computer screen without seeing absolutely anything, while the blood ran hot in her veins and thoughts stumbled over each other in her head. She had been invited, personally, by Jaden Schultz, to an elegant party where she could finally be seen as more than just the ugly secretary who organized papers and made coffee. The rest of the day passed in a fog of anxiety, mixed with excitement, and she was already mentally planning what she would wear, how she would do her hair, whether she should try makeup for the first time in her life. The possibility of finally being noticed, of finally being included, of finally being something more than the walking joke of the office made her eyes shine behind the thick lenses. On Thursday, with only one day left until the event, Betty was finishing filing some documents when she heard voices coming from Jaden's office. The door was slightly open, and she recognized the laughter of his friends, those rich and powerful men who sometimes showed up for business lunches or informal meetings. She approached the door to let them know she was leaving early because she needed to get a dress. But she stopped when she heard her name being mentioned in the middle of the masculine laughter. "So you actually invited Ugly Betty to the party?" The voice belonged to Axel. Bryant, one of Jaden's closest friends, and the tone was one of cruel amusement. "I did," Jaden replied, and Betty felt her heart race because maybe he was going to defend her. Maybe he was going to say she deserved to be there. "Dude, that's genius. Bet how long it takes her to realize it's a joke," another voice said between laughs, and Betty felt the world start to spin slowly. "Imagine her getting all dressed up for the event," Axel continued in that mocking tone that cut like glass. "She'll look even more pathetic than she already is." The laughter grew louder, and Betty put her hand over her mouth to hold back the sound that wanted to escape from her throat. A moan of pain so deep, it seemed to come from somewhere very old inside her chest. Her legs were shaking, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling, right there in the hallway. "You guys are cruel," Jaden said, but he was laughing too, that deep, relaxed laugh that she had always thought was beautiful, and that now sounded like the ugliest thing in the world. Betty didn't wait to hear anything else. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands and left the office without caring about the papers that were scattered on the desk or the computer still on. The elevator took an eternity to arrive, and when the doors closed, she finally allowed the tears to fall hot and heavy down her face. The walk to the apartment she shared with her sister Sella was a blur of lights and people and sounds that she didn't register because the pain in her chest occupied all the available space. The words kept echoing in her head like a scratched record that wouldn't stop. Playing joke, pathetic, ugly Betty. When she got home, Sella was in the living room reading a fashion magazine and looked up with that warm smile she always had. But the smile died when she saw her sister's face. "Betty!" "What happened?" She stood up quickly and walked to where Betty was standing in the doorway, still holding her purse too tightly. Hip. Betty tried to speak, but the words got lost in the middle of the sobs that were now shaking her entire body. Sela pulled her into a tight hug and waited in silence while Betty cried with an intensity that seemed endless. It took almost half an hour until she was able to tell everything with a broken voice and swollen eyes, and when she finished, she saw something light up in her sister's gaze. "They'll never laugh at me again," Betty said in a voice that didn't sound like hers, a voice full of a cold, cutting determination that surprised even herself. "I'll look gorgeous and make them all eat their words." Sela held her sister's face between her hands and looked into her eyes with a seriousness that Betty had never seen before. "You've always been beautiful, Betty, always. But if you want to do this, if you want to show them who you really can be, then I'm going to help you with everything I have." Betty wiped the tears with the back of her hand and felt something change inside her, something that was part fury and part rebirth. The pain was still there, pulsing deep in her chest. But now it had company, and the company was called revenge. "I need your help," she said, and her voice came out firm this time, without trembling. "You've always had it," Sailor replied with a smile that was both gentle and fierce. "I've always waited for this moment. We're going to make you shine so bright, they'll need sunglasses just to look in. Your direction." Betty nodded, and for the first time in 3 years she felt something like hope, but it was a strange hope. Tinged with anger and determination, she was going to show up at that party, yes, but not as the joke they expected. She was going to show up as the version of herself that had always existed, underneath the shapeless clothes and thick glasses and lifeless hair. She was going to show up as someone they would never forget. And Jaden Schultz was going to choke on his champagne when he saw her walk into that ballroom. Because Betty Gibbies had just made a promise to herself, and she had no intention whatsoever of breaking that promise. The transformation was going to start tomorrow morning, and it wasn't going to stop until she was unrecognizable, until she was everything they never imagined she could be. Chapter 2. The Total Transformation.
That can't possibly be Betty.
Sela arrived at the apartment 2 hours due after Betty's call with an energy that seemed capable of lighting up the entire living room. She brought a folder full of notes, magazine clippings, and a list so long it took up 3 entire pages, and her eyes shone with that mixture of determination and genuine joy that only a sister could have in a moment like that. "I've always waited for this moment," she said as she tossed her bag on the couch and opened the folder on the coffee table. "We're going to do everything, Betty. Absolutely everything." Betty's eyes were still swollen from crying so much, but now there was something different in her expression, a firmness that wasn't there before, as if the pain had burned the old version of her and left only ash and determination in its place. She looked at the list that Sela held out and felt her heart race with a mixture of fear and excitement. "It starts tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Sela continued as she circled items on the list with a gold pen. First the hair, then dermatologist, personal stylist in the afternoon, and on Saturday we finish with makeup and shopping. I have money saved up," Betty said with her voice still a little hoarse. 3 years of not spending on anything but the basics gives you a good reserve." Sela smiled and held her sister's hand with a firm, comforting squeeze. "This isn't about money. It's about you finally allowing yourself to shine. You've always been beautiful. You just needed someone to show you how to enhance it." The next morning, Betty was sitting in the swivel chair at the most renowned salon in the city, while 3 professionals examined her hair under lights that were too bright. The lead stylist was a man named Vincent, who spoke fast and gestured even faster, and he held strands of her hair with an almost reverent delicacy. "We have a perfect blank canvas here," he said to his assistant as he ran his fingers through the lifeless brown hair. "Layered cut to add movement, honey and caramel highlights to warm up the tone. Reconstruction treatment, because these strands are crying out for help." Betty didn't say anything because she didn't know what to say, but she felt Sela squeeze her shoulder in a silent gesture of encouragement. The next 4 hours were a sped-up montage of scissors, brushes, bowls of dye that smelled too strong, and conversations she barely followed because she was too focused on the mixture of terror and anticipation growing in her chest. When Vincent finally spun the chair toward the mirror, Betty held her breath and for a second didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. The hair now fell in soft waves to her shoulders with a shine she'd never seen before, and the highlights created a depth that made her face look completely different, more delicate, more defined. "Oh my God," she whispered, and saw Sela's eyes fill with tears in the reflection. "I told you," Sela replied with a choked voice. "You just needed to enhance." The next stop was the dermatology clinic where a doctor named Dr. Helena examined Betty's face with an illuminated magnifying glass and made notes on a silver tablet. She had that efficient, direct manner of someone who had seen thousands of faces and knew exactly what each one needed. Deep dark circles from lack of sleep or genetics, dehydrated skin, expression lines starting to appear, she said as she touched Betty's face with latex gloves. "We're going to do hyaluronic acid filler for the dark circles, preventive Botox on the forehead, laser treatment for texture, and deep hydration. Betty heard all of that and felt a pang of panic because it seemed too invasive, too permanent. But then she remembered Jaden's laughter and his friends, and the anger came back, hot and fortifying. "Go ahead," she said, with more firmness than she expected. The procedures were quick and less painful than she'd imagined. Just small pricks followed by a strange coldness on the skin. And when it was over, her face was slightly swollen, but Dr. Helena assured her that in 2 days it would be perfect. "You'll see the complete difference in a week," she said as she applied a soothing ointment, "and it will be transformative." On Saturday morning, Sailor showed up with a huge suitcase full of makeup, organized by color and function, and spread everything on top of the vanity in Betty's room as if she were setting up a scientific laboratory. "Makeup isn't about hiding. It's about enhancing what's already there," she began, as she lined up brushes of different sizes. "You have big eyes, defined cheekbones, and full lips. We just need to teach you how to work with them." The next 3 hours were an intensive class on primers, foundations, concealers, contours, blushes, eyeshadows, eyeliners, and lipsticks. Salah explained each step with infinite patience, while showing techniques for blending, creating depth, opening up the eyes, and Betty absorbed everything, with a concentration she usually reserved for financial spreadsheets. "Your skin is cool-toned, so colors like pink, purple, and blue work better than oranges," Sailor said as she applied a pink blush on her cheeks. "And for the eyes, brown and bronze tones will make the green in them pop." Betty looked in the mirror and saw each layer of makeup transform her face into something that seemed both familiar and completely new. It wasn't a mask, it was a revelation, as if she were discovering features that had always been there, but had never been illuminated the right way. In the afternoon, the personal stylist that Sailor hired arrived with 2 assistants and at least 20 bags of clothes from stores that Betty only knew in passing when she walked through them all. The woman's name was Isabella, and she had a sharp gaze that assessed Betty's body in less than 10 seconds. "You have an hourglass silhouette that's being hidden by clothes 3 sizes too big," she said, without beating around the bush, as she pulled a red dress from a bag. "We're going to work with cuts that cinch the waist, colors that flatter your skin tone, and fabrics that have structure without being uncomfortable." What followed was an endless parade of fittings, combinations, analyses of colors and fabrics, while Isabella discarded pieces with a quick wave of her hand or approved them with a satisfied smile. Betty tried on dresses, skirts, pants, blouses, blazers, and each piece that worked was hung on a separate rack that kept growing. "This pencil skirt in black with the navy blue silk blouse," Isabella said, pointing to a combination. "Powerful without being aggressive, elegant without being too conservative." By the end of the afternoon, Betty had a completely new wardrobe organized by occasion and color, and Isabella still made a point of teaching her how to accessorize each look, when to wear high heels versus flats, and how to adjust her posture to walk with confidence. "Clothes only work if you believe you deserve to be wearing them," Isabella said, before leaving. "And you deserve it, honey." On Sunday, Sailor took Betty to put in contact lenses for the first time in years, and after half an hour of frustrated attempts and watering eyes, she finally succeeded. The world became sharper without the barrier of thick glasses, and Betty blinked several times, trying to get used to the strange sensation of freedom. "You can still wear glasses when you want," Sailor reminded her, "but now you have the option to choose." The last stop was the studio of an eyebrow designer who worked with tweezers, wax, and dye until Betty's eyebrows had a perfect arch that opened up her gaze in an almost dramatic way. Each change seemed small in isolation, but together they created a transformation that was impossible to ignore. On Monday morning, a full week after the desperate call to Sailor, Betty was standing in front of the full-length mirror in her room, wearing one of the outfits that Isabella had chosen. The gray tailored pants cinched the waist and elongated her legs. The white silk blouse had a cut that flattered her shoulders without being too revealing, and the black medium heels gave balance to the look. Her hair fell in controlled waves, the makeup was light but transformative, and the contact lenses made her green eyes even more prominent. She could barely believe that the woman in the mirror was the same person who a week ago was crying desperately on the living room floor. The doorbell rang, and Betty opened the door to find Rose Martinez, her best friend since college, standing there with a bag of coffee and croissants. Rose looked at her and the bag literally fell from her hand, hitting the hallway floor. "Betty!" The voice came out as an incredulous whisper. "Is that you? Oh my God!" Betty smiled and felt a wave of warm satisfaction run through her entire body. "It's me!" Rose entered the apartment, still in shock, and spun around Betty, examining every detail of the transformation with wide eyes. She touched her hair carefully as if afraid it would disappear, and then pulled her friend into a tight hug. "You look absolutely stunning," Rose said with a choked voice. "What happened?" Betty told her everything over coffee, from the cruel invitation to the decision to transform herself, and Rose listened in silence with an expression that went from anger to admiration. When Betty finished, Rose held her hands tightly. "They're going to choke when they see you," she said with a fierce smile. "And you're going to savor every second of it." Sela appeared in the living room at that moment with a dress hanging on a hanger, a dress that made Betty hold her breath just from looking at it. It was a deep blue that seemed to change tone depending on the light, with a cut that promised to flatter every curve without being vulgar. And it had a timeless elegance that screamed sophistication. "For the party," Sela said simply as she hung the dress in the closet. "You're going to walk into that ballroom, and they're going to forget how to breathe." Betty looked at the dress and felt something change inside her, something that was part power and part rebirth. The woman who was going to show up at the majestic hotel party wouldn't be the pathetic secretary they expected to ridicule. She would be someone completely new, someone they'd never imagined existed beneath the surface. "You've always been beautiful," Sela repeated the words she'd said on the first night, but now Betty could believe them. "You just needed to enhance." And as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the shiny hair and transformed face and confident posture, Betty knew she was ready to walk into that ballroom and prove they had underestimated the wrong woman, ready to see the shock in Jaden's eyes when he realized the monumental mistake he'd made. Revenge had never seemed so sweet, and it hadn't even started yet. Chapter 3. Triumphant Entrance and New Personality.
Someone here wants to see me fall, but they have no idea what they've started.
The majestic hotel gleamed like a giant jewel in the center of the city, and the golden lights illuminating the neoclassical facade created a dramatic contrast against the dark Friday night sky. Betty stepped out of the Uber, with her legs shaking slightly inside the 4-inch heels. But Sela's hand on her arm served as an anchor and reminder that she wasn't alone in this moment. "Take a deep breath and remember why you're here," Sela whispered as she adjusted the thin strap of the blue dress that shimmered softly under the entrance lights. "You're going to walk in there and show each one of them who you really are." Betty nodded and breathed in deeply, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs as adrenaline ran hot through her veins. The deep blue dress fell perfectly on her body, cinching at the waist and following her curves in a way she'd never experienced before. And her hair in loose waves shone with the strategic highlights that Sela had spent an hour adjusting. The makeup was flawless, with eyes lined subtly but intensely, and lips in a rosy, nude tone that elongated her face. And the discreet jewelry that Sela had lent completed the look without weighing it down. Betty looked at the hotel entrance, where other people were already walking in, laughing and chatting. And for a second, the urge to run was so strong that she almost turned around. "No," she said out loud, more to herself than to Sela. "I'm not running. Not anymore." They walked together to the entrance, and the doorman opened the double glass doors, revealing the white marble lobby that led to the main event hall. Betty could hear the sound of soft music and animated conversations coming from inside, and her stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and anticipation that was almost unbearable. Sela stopped before the ballroom entrance and held Betty's face between her, hands looking into her green eyes with fierce intensity. "Go there and kill it," she said simply before stepping away and leaving Betty alone at the entrance. Betty adjusted her posture like Isabella had taught her, lifted her chin, and entered the ballroom with calculated, firm steps. What happened in the next 5 seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion, and she registered every detail with an almost painful clarity. The ballroom was packed with at least 200 people dressed in formal wear, chatting in small groups around tables decorated with white floral arrangements and scented candles. The walls were covered by huge mirrors that reflected the lights from the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. And a band played soft jazz on a stage set up in the right corner. But none of that mattered, because the exact moment Betty crossed the main door, the conversations began to die one by one, like dominoes falling in sequence. People turned their heads to look, and then completely stopped what they were doing, and in less than 10 seconds, the entire ballroom was in absolute silence. Betty kept walking with her heart beating so hard that she was sure everyone could hear it. But she maintained a neutral expression and upright posture while feeling the weight of hundreds of gazes on her. Her shoes made a rhythmic sound against the marble floor, and the dress swayed, gently with each step creating an almost hypnotic effect. On the other side of the ballroom, near the champagne bar, she saw Jaden with a glass in his hand talking to Axel and two other men she recognized from the office. He was wearing a black suit with a dark blue tie and had that relaxed posture of someone who felt completely at ease in any environment. But when his eyes met hers, everything changed. The glass slipped from Jaden's hand and fell to the floor, shattering into a 1,000 pieces as the champagne spread across the marble. But he didn't even look down. His dark eyes were fixed on Betty, with an expression of shock so deep that his eyebrows raised and his mouth opened slightly. "That can't be the same person," she heard someone whisper near the bar. "She's a goddess," another man responded in a low voice, but not low enough. Betty kept walking toward their group without looking away, and saw the exact moment recognition crossed Jaden's face. His eyes widened even more, and he took a step forward as if to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. Axel was completely paralyzed with his drink frozen halfway to his mouth, and the other two men looked at her as if they were seeing an apparition. Betty stopped just 10 feet away from the group and let a small, controlled smile appear on her lips. "Good evening, Mr. Schultz," she said with her voice soft, but clear enough for everyone around to hear. "Thank you for the invitation." Jaden's voice failed twice before finally coming out. "Betty, is that really you?" "Of course it's me," she replied, keeping her tone light, but with a gleam in her eyes that made it clear she knew exactly the effect she was causing. "Who else would I be?" The entire ballroom was still silent, watching the interaction, and Betty could feel the electric tension in the air as people tried to process the impossible transformation they had just witnessed. She saw Miranda Frost near one of the tables with an expression of pure shock, mixed with envy, and the satisfaction Betty felt was almost intoxicating. "You look completely different," Jaden finally managed to say, and his voice had a tone of admiration he couldn't hide. "Thank you," Betty replied simply before turning and walking toward the bar, leaving the group of men still paralyzed behind her. The rest of the night was a dizzying sequence of admiring looks, men approaching to make conversation, and constant attention that Betty had never experienced in her life. She felt each gaze as validation and each comment of admiration as a balm for the wounds that years of humiliation had left. Rose appeared beside her at some point during the night, with a proud smile and champagne glasses in her hands. "You killed it," she said, extending a glass. "They literally stopped breathing when you walked in." Betty accepted the champagne and took a sip, feeling the bubbles burst on her tongue as she observed the ballroom. Jaden still looked in her direction from time to time, and always quickly looked away when she caught him watching, and the power dynamic had completely shifted in a way she'd never imagined possible. But something strange began to happen in the weeks following the party. Betty found herself increasingly obsessed with her own appearance in a way that went beyond simple vanity or personal care. She woke up an hour earlier every day to do perfect makeup and choose the ideal look, and started checking her reflection in every mirrored surface she found. Her Instagram transformed into a carefully curated gallery of photos in pastel and pink tones where each image was edited to perfection. And she spent hours choosing the right filters and the most impactful captions. The YouTube videos she watched before bed were exclusively makeup tutorials and skincare tips, and the bookshelf that used to have books was now full of palettes and brushes. "Did you see the new Rare Beauty blush?" she asked Rose during lunch the Monday, after the party. The texture is incredible, and the pigment lasts all day without needing to retouch. Rose looked at her with a strange expression as she picked at her salad without much interest. Betty, we were talking about the promotion you missed at work, she said carefully. Remember, the position that went to Miranda? Oh, right. Betty replied, distracted as she checked her makeup in the compact mirror. But don't you think this contour is a little heavy in natural light? Rose put her fork on the plate with a sound louder than necessary, and that finally caught Betty's attention. You're different, Rose said, and there was something like concern in her voice. And not just visually, you're different on the inside too. Betty closed the mirror with a snap and looked at her friend with a defensive expression she didn't even recognize in herself. Different how? More confident, more beautiful? That should be a good thing. Colder, Rose replied without beating around the bush. More calculating. You barely listen to me when I talk about anything that isn't makeup or clothes, or which brand is better. Betty felt something contract in her chest but pushed the feeling down hard. I just finally learned to value myself, she said with her voice harder than she intended. Sorry if that bothers you. The conversation died there and they finished lunch. Intense silence, but Betty couldn't stop thinking about Rose's words even after returning to the office. She tried to concentrate on the reports, but her mind kept going back to the hurt expression on her friend's face. On Thursday of that week, Jaden finally attempted an approach. He appeared at Betty's desk at the end of the workday when most people had already left, and stood there with his hands in his dress pants pockets looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. You're different, he said, and his voice had a tone of admiration mixed with something that seemed like confusion. Betty saved the file she was working on and turned her chair to face him, maintaining a neutral, controlled expression. I am, she agreed simply. I wanted to invite you to dinner, he continued, and there was a strange vulnerability in his voice that didn't match the powerful, controlled man she knew. To talk about everything. Betty let the silence stretch for a few seconds as she watched the discomfort grow on his face, and then smiled that small, cold smile she'd perfected in recent weeks. Now you notice me, she asked with her voice soft but cutting like glass. When I was 3 sizes too big and wearing thick glasses, you invited me to parties as a joke. Now that I'm beautiful, you want dinner. Jaden opened his mouth, but no sound came out, and Betty saw the exact moment guilt crossed his face. Betty, No, she cut him off as she grabbed her purse and stood up. You had your chance to see me as a person. You missed it. She walked past him without looking back and felt a bitter satisfaction spread through her chest. But it was an empty satisfaction that didn't fill the hole that was growing inside her. The external transformation had been complete, but something was changing, internally too, and Betty wasn't sure she liked the person she was becoming. The cold, calculating person who only talked about makeup and contouring. The person who was losing her best friend because she couldn't stop checking her own reflection. The person who had traded authenticity for external approval and now didn't know anymore who she really was underneath all those layers of foundation and primer. But admitting that would mean admitting the transformation had a price, and Betty wasn't ready to pay that bill yet. Chapter 4. Superficiality and Sabotage.
You're not alone anymore. I'm not letting anyone hurt you.
The weeks following the party turned into a whirlwind of obsession that consumed every hour of Betty's day in a way she couldn't completely control herself. The apartment she shared with Sella had become a kind of beauty sanctuary, with the vanity packed with products organized by category and function, and the bathroom was full of creams and serums that she applied religiously. Every night following tutorials she watched until late. The morning always started at 5:30, because she needed at least 2 hours to get ready before leaving for work, and the ritual included a 7-step skincare routine followed by makeup that took 45 minutes to get perfect. Betty checked her reflection in every mirrored surface she encountered during the day and reapplied lipstick every 2 hours, even when it wasn't necessary. And her purse was always full of emergency products in case any imperfection appeared. Her Instagram had become a perfectly curated gallery of photos in pastel and pink tones where each image went through at least 15 minutes of editing. Before being published, Betty spent hours choosing filters that made her skin more even and her eyes brighter, and each caption was thought through and rethought until it sounded casual, but impactful at the same time. Her followers had increased from 200 to almost 5,000 in just a few weeks, and she checked likes compulsively every 10 minutes, waiting for the validation that came with each red heart that appeared on the screen. The YouTube videos she watched before bed were exclusively makeup tutorials and skincare tips presented by influencers who had seemingly perfect lives and flawless skin. Betty wrote down every product mentioned in a specific notebook and researched prices and reviews before buying, and the bookshelf that used to have romance novels and thrillers was now full of eyeshadow palettes organized by brand and brushes stored in transparent acrylic containers. "Don't you think you're overdoing it a bit?" Sailor asked one Tuesday morning, while drinking coffee and watching Betty apply the third layer of concealer to dark circles that barely existed. "You're already beautiful. You don't need that much product." Betty stopped with the brush in the air and looked at her sister through the mirror with an expression that mixed defensiveness and irritation, and her stomach tightened with that uncomfortable feeling of being judged by the person who should support her unconditionally. "You were the one who taught me all this," she replied with her voice colder than she intended, as she went back to see, applying concealer with precise movements. "Now you're saying it's too much. I taught you to enhance, not to hide who you are," Sailor said carefully, as she stirred her coffee without looking directly at her, and there was genuine concern in her voice that Betty didn't want to acknowledge. "And lately it seems like you're hiding behind all this makeup instead of just using it to feel good." Betty didn't respond because her sister's words had hit something painful and true inside her chest. But instead of processing what she was feeling, she simply applied more blush to her cheekbones and changed the subject, asking if Sailor had seen the new liquid lipstick collection that had arrived at Sephora. The truth was, she didn't know how to be the old version of herself anymore and was afraid to discover that version would never come back. And it was easier to focus on contouring and primers than to face that scary reality. At the office, things had gotten tense in a different way, because now Betty received too much attention from people who used to completely ignore her, and this bothered some colleagues who saw her transformation as a threat or a personal affront. Miranda Frost was the most vocal in her disapproval, and she had started making increasingly direct and cruel comments about Betty's new appearance whenever she had the opportunity to do so in front of other people. "That's some heavy makeup today, Betty," Miranda said loudly during a morning meeting while everyone was still settling into the conference room and organizing notebooks and pens. "Are you trying to get someone specific's attention, or do you just like looking over the top?" The people around fell into awkward silence, and some looked down, pretending to be very interested in the papers in front of them. And Betty felt the blood rush hot to her face as all eyes eventually turned in her direction, waiting for a reaction. She kept her expression neutral, even with her heart beating too hard inside her chest and her fingers gripping the pen with enough force to leave her knuckles white and aching. "I just like taking care of myself, Miranda," she replied with her voice controlled, but with a dangerous gleam in her eyes. That made it clear she wasn't going to accept the provocation passively. "You should try it sometime instead of just standing there criticizing people." "Who do?" Miranda turned red to the roots of her bleached blonde hair and opened her mouth to respond with something probably even crueler. But Jaden walked into the room at that exact moment, carrying a brown leather folder, and the meeting started before the situation could escalate into something worse. Betty tried to concentrate on the numbers and charts being presented on the large screen at the back of the room, but the anger still pulsed in her veins, mixed with a shame she didn't want to admit even to herself. After the meeting, Rose found her in the women's bathroom on the 15th floor, where Betty was retouching her eyeliner for the 4th time that morning, though it was absolutely perfect and didn't need any adjustment. Rose leaned against the sink next to her, with her arms crossed over her grey blazer and a worried expression that Betty knew all too well after years of friendship. "We need to talk," Rose said without beating around the bush, and her voice had that tone of a friend who won't lie just to make you feel better. or to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation. About what you're becoming. Betty put away the eyeliner in her makeup bag without looking directly at Rose because she knew that if she looked, she'd see the clear disappointment in her friend's brown eyes, and that would be much worse than any mean comment Miranda could make. "And what exactly am I becoming, Rose?" she asked with a defensive tone as she closed her purse harder than necessary, making the zipper grind. "Someone I don't recognize anymore," Rose replied with brutal honesty, and there was a sadness in her voice that cut deeper than any anger could. "You've forgotten who you really are, Betty. The person I met in college didn't care what Miranda or anyone else thought about her, because she knew her own worth independent of external appearance." Betty felt something contract painfully in her chest, but pushed the feeling down hard and finally turned to face her friend with an expression that tried to be firm but probably just looked hurt. "People change, Rose," she said simply as she adjusted the purse strap on her shoulder. "I changed. That should be a good thing." "Changing is one thing," Rose replied with her voice getting firmer and her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Completely losing the essence of what makes you unique is something completely different. You don't talk about anything else besides makeup and which blush brand lasts longer or which primer works best. When was the last time we talked about anything that actually matters?" Betty opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't think of anything that would justify her behavior in recent weeks, so she simply left the bathroom without saying a word and spent the rest of the day avoiding Rose because the conversation had touched on things she absolutely wasn't ready to face or process. The hard, undeniable truth was that she knew deep down that Rose was right, but admitting it out loud would mean admitting that the transformation she had fought so hard for had emotional costs she hadn't foreseen or considered when she started all this. Rose's attempts to reconnect continued during the following week, but Betty systematically dodged all opportunities to really talk. When her friend suggested having lunch together, she made up excuses about having too many reports to finish. And when Rose sent messages asking if she wanted to watch a movie over the Addy weekend like they used to, she simply responded with vague emojis and never confirmed concrete plans. The distance between them grew with each passing day, and Betty could feel the friendship unraveling like an old fabric being pulled at the seams. But wounded pride and the refusal to admit she was wrong were too strong to allow her to give in and apologize. The following Friday, there was another company party to celebrate closing an important contract with Horizon that had taken months of intense negotiations, and Betty spent hours choosing the perfect dress for the occasion because she knew Miranda would be there, and she absolutely couldn't show up looking anything less than flawless. She decided on an emerald green design that had delicate pearl necklace sewn into the neckline, forming an elegant pattern, and that brought out the color of her eyes in an almost dramatic way, and the makeup was meticulously planned to complement the dress tone with golden eyeshadows and lips in a soft rosy nude. Selah helped with her hair, making large, loose waves that fell down her back like a shiny, polished waterfall. But there was a silent, heavy tension between them that hadn't existed before the transformation began. Her sister made no comments about the look being too perfect or about Betty overdoing the production, but her silence said much more than any words of criticism or concern could say. "Are you okay?" Selah finally asked when she finished pinning the last strand of hair in place with invisible bobby pins. "Why does everyone keep asking me that?" Betty replied more aggressively than she intended as she checked her makeup in the mirror for the 10th time. "I'm great. Better than ever, actually." Selah didn't respond, but the look she gave Betty through the mirror's reflection was loaded with a concern that made her stomach twist uncomfortably, and for the first time in weeks Betty wondered if maybe everyone who cared about her was seeing something she herself was refusing to see. The party was at the same majestic hotel with its imposing architecture and crystal chandeliers that reflected light in all directions. And when Betty entered the ballroom, she felt that same wave of concentrated attention she had felt the first time. People turned to look, and men smiled with barely disguised admiration as she walked toward the bar where champagne glasses were lined up in perfect rows on silver trays. But this time the satisfaction she expected to feel with all that attention was strangely mixed with something empty and hollow she couldn't name. Miranda was near the canapé buffet, talking to two other women from the finance department, and when she saw Betty enter the ballroom, her expression closed into a mask of pure envy and barely disguised anger that distorted the normally controlled features of her face. Betty pretended not to notice the venomous look and grabbed a champagne glass at the bar, trying to relax her tense shoulders and enjoy the night. But there was an electric tension in the air that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in anticipation of something bad that was about to happen. "You look absolutely beautiful," a male voice said beside her, and Betty turned to find a man she didn't know, smiling with interest that was too obvious and uncomfortable. She thanked him politely with an automatic smile that didn't reach her eyes and dodged the conversation with some excuse about needing to greet some people, because she had no patience whatsoever for superficial and empty interactions with strangers who were only interested in the external packaging. Betty walked toward the outdoor terrace, where the fresh night air could help clear her head that was starting to ache slightly at the temples. But when she passed near the buffet, she felt someone bump into her with deliberate and purposeful force. Before she could react or understand what was happening, an absolutely freezing liquid was being thrown directly at her face and body with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. Betty choked with the physical shock and the icy temperature of the water, and when she finally managed to open her stinging eyes, she saw Miranda standing right in front of her, holding an empty ice bucket with an expression of cruel and triumphant satisfaction that made her stomach turn. The ice water had completely soaked the emerald green dress that now clung to her body uncomfortably and heavily, and the hair that Sella had spent an hour styling was dripping water dirty with makeup that ran down her face in black and brown streaks. Betty raised her hands, trembling both from cold and shock, and touched her face, feeling the pasty texture of foundation mixed with mascara and eyeliner melting under her fingers. The entire ballroom fell into a silence so absolute that you could hear the sound of water drops falling from her dress and hitting the marble floor, and Betty heard some muffled gasps of shock and disbelief as people processed the surreal scene unfolding in front of them. She looked down with vision blurred by tears that were beginning to form and saw that the water had completely ruined the dress that was now stained and deformed, clinging against her frozen skin. "Over the top and vulgar," Miranda said in a voice loud and clear enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear every poisonous word, trying to get attention with all this ridiculous and desperate production. "Now everyone can see what you really are inside without all that makeup mask, hiding the truth." And then with a quick and cruel movement, Miranda grabbed the delicate pearl necklace sewn into the dress neckline and pulled hard enough to rip the beads off one by one. The pearls scattered across the polished marble floor, rolling in all possible directions while the sound of them hitting the hard surfaces echoed through the deadly silence of the ballroom like gunshots, and Betty was completely paralyzed, feeling humiliation burn much stronger and deeper than any physical pain could ever burn. The makeup ran down her face in black rivers of mascara and brown eyeshadow and beige foundation, creating a grotesque effect that she could feel but not see. And when she brought her hand to her face, her fingers came back dirty with the pasty mixture of products that had taken 45 minutes to apply perfectly. Her hair dripped ice water down her back, soaking the ruined dress even more, and Betty felt her knees weaken as the reality of what had just happened finally penetrated through the initial shock. The people around started whispering among themselves with hands covering their mouths in false concern, and Betty saw some cell phones being raised discreetly to capture photos and videos of the moment of public humiliation that would certainly be on social media before she could even leave that place. The exposure was total and devastating in a way that made even Jaden's cruel joke seem insignificant in comparison. Rose appeared from the middle of the crowd of people watching as if they were watching a car accident happen in slow motion, and she had her face red with contained anger as she walked straight to Betty. With determined steps, she took off the silk shawl she was wearing on her shoulders and tried to cover her friend with it in a gesture of protection and care, and then held Betty's arm gently, trying to guide her away from the cruel stares and invasive cameras. But Betty pulled away abruptly from the touch with a force that surprised them both and almost made Rose stumble backward. "No," Betty said with her voice coming out choked and torn by the mixture of anger and pain and humiliation. "I don't need your help, Rose." "Betty, please," Rose begged, and there were genuine tears in her brown eyes too as she extended her hand again, trying to reach her friend. "Let me take you home. You don't need to stay here dealing with this. You don't understand the pressure of being perfect," Betty practically shouted, and the words came out loaded with all the frustration and pain and desperation that had accumulated in recent weeks with nowhere to go. "You've always just been you. You've always been naturally beautiful without needing to try. Never had to prove anything to anyone, or work hard to be noticed or accepted." Rose recoiled as if she'd been physically slapped in the face, and the hurt and shocked expression that took over her features was infinitely worse than anything Miranda had done or said. Betty saw her best friend slowly turn her back and leave the ballroom without looking back even once, and some distant and still rational part of her consciousness screamed loudly that she had just made a terrible and possibly irreversible mistake. But wounded pride and blinding anger and crushing pain were too strong and too consuming to allow her to run after Rose and apologize and admit she was completely wrong. Betty stood there in the middle of the ballroom, dripping dirty water, and melted. Makeup while people continued staring and whispering and taking photos as if she were a circus attraction. And for the first time since the transformation had begun, she wished she could simply disappear and never have to face anyone ever again. Betty left the hotel alone, dragging her high heels that hurt her swollen feet, with the emerald green dress soaked and ruined, clinging to her frozen body, and her hair dripping water dirty with dissolved makeup down her bare back. The cold autumn night air hit her wet skin, making her shake violently, but she kept walking without a clear direction or specific destination, because the only thing that really mattered at that moment was getting away from that cursed place and those cruel people as fast and as far as possible. The streets were relatively empty at that time of night, and the few pedestrians who passed looked at her with expressions that ranged between concern and morbid curiosity. But Betty kept her head down and her arms crossed over her chest, trying to retain some body heat as she walked. The tears finally started falling uncontrollably, mixing with the remains of mascara and eyeliner that still stained her face, and she made no effort to wipe them away or hide them, because honestly there was nothing left to hide or protect. When she finally arrived at the apartment, after what seemed like an eternity, walking in the cold, Selah was in the living room, waiting, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea in her hands. The expression on her sister's face changed instantly from anxious worry to absolute horror when she saw the devastated state Betty had arrived in, and she stood up so fast that the tea almost spilled on the beige rug. "Oh my God, Betty, what happened?" Selah asked as she ran to her and tried to hug her shaking sister. But Betty pulled away from the offered hug with the same automatic rejection she had given Rose, because accepting comfort at that moment would mean admitting defeat, and she still wasn't ready to be that vulnerable, even in front of her own sister. "I just wanted to be beautiful," Betty said with her voice completely broken and shattered as the tears fell harder and harder. "I just wanted them to stop laughing at me and treat me like a person who deserves respect. That's all I wanted." Selah held her shoulders firmly, ignoring the resistance, and looked directly into her green eyes, now red from crying so much, with an intensity that cut through all the fog of pain and anger and self-pity. "You've always been beautiful, Betty," she said with her voice firm but incredibly gentle at the same time. "Always. But you're getting ugly on the inside with all this obsession and superficiality. And that's infinitely much worse than anything you ever were before the transformation." The words hit like a punch straight to the stomach, knocking all the air from her lungs, and Betty felt her legs finally really weaken. She let herself fall onto the couch any which way and covered her face with her frozen and dirty hands as she sobbed with a violent intensity that shook her entire body. And for the first time since she had heard that cruel conversation behind the office door weeks ago, she seriously wondered if the revenge and the transformation and all the temporary satisfaction had really been worth it. In the end, Rose wasn't talking to her anymore, and probably never would again after what Betty had said in the ballroom. Selah was clearly disappointed and worried about the person her sister was becoming. Miranda had managed to humiliate her publicly in the worst possible way in front of hundreds of witnesses and cell phone cameras. And the worst part of all this was that Betty had become exactly the type of superficial and empty and cruel person she had always deeply despised. And now she had no idea how she could go back and fix everything she had broken in the process. The external transformation had been complete and even spectacular according to all objective standards of beauty, but the emotional and relational price had been losing the only people who really cared about her for real and not just about the pretty packaging. And Betty was finally beginning to realize that no amount of expensive makeup or designer clothes or Instagram followers could ever fill the void that was growing larger and larger inside her chest. The beauty she had conquered with so much effort and pain was rapidly becoming an elegant and suffocating prison from which she had no idea how to escape. And sitting there on the couch, soaked and destroyed and completely alone, Betty finally understood that she had lost herself completely in the middle of all that transformation. Chapter 5: Danger and Rescue.
Tomorrow they'll see a version of me they never imagined existed.
A week after the public humiliation at the Majestic Hotel, Betty still avoided leaving the apartment on weekends and spent most of her time locked in her room, staring at the white ceiling, unable to find motivation to do absolutely anything. The ruined emerald green dress hung in the closet as a constant reminder of the disaster her life had become, and she still hadn't found the strength to throw it away or even get it out of sight. Sailor knocked on the door from time to time, bringing food that Betty barely touched and asking gentle questions that received monosyllabic answers. But her sister had learned not to force conversations when she saw that Betty simply wasn't ready to process everything that had happened. Rose hadn't sent any messages since the night of the party, and her silence was more painful than any words of anger or disappointment could be. At work, Betty went back to wearing less flashy clothes and more discreet makeup, trying to go unnoticed through the hallways. But it was impossible to ignore the curious looks and whispers that followed her everywhere. Miranda walked around the office with a permanent smile of satisfaction on her high face, and Betty made a point of avoiding her whenever she saw the woman approaching, because she didn't trust herself to keep her composure if she had to interact directly. On Wednesday of the following week, a notification appeared on Betty's phone announcing another company party, scheduled for Friday night at an exclusive club downtown. It was an informal networking event to celebrate the quarter's partnerships, and attendance was technically optional, but everyone knew that showing up was practically mandatory for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously, professionally. Betty looked at the digital invitation for a long time, feeling her stomach turn at the idea of having to face all those people again. But then she thought about how much worse it would be to stay home alone, knowing everyone would be there, probably commenting on her absence, and came to the conclusion that going would be the lesser of two evils. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sailor asked on Thursday night when Betty casually mentioned she was going to the party. "No one will judge you if you don't show up. I need to go." Betty replied with a determination she didn't completely feel. "I can't let Miranda think she completely destroyed me." On Friday, Betty chose a simple, elegant black dress that didn't draw too much attention, but still made her feel minimally confident, and did light makeup that enhanced without overdoing it. She arrived at the club at 8 at night, and the electronic music pulsed so loud you could feel the vibration in the dark wooden floor, and colored lights spun, creating hypnotic patterns on the walls and high ceiling. The place was packed with Schultz Enterprises employees chatting in animated groups around high tables, and Betty grabbed a drink at the bar, trying to look relaxed even with tense muscles. She saw Jaden on the other side of the room, talking to some executives, and when their eyes met for a second, he seemed to want to approach. But she quickly looked away and walked in the opposite direction. "Betty, what a nice surprise to see you here," a male voice said beside her, and she turned to find Axel Bryant smiling with that fake charm that had always annoyed her, even before hearing him laugh at the cruel joke Jaden had made. He was tall and had blonde hair slicked back with gel that was too shiny, and wore a gray suit that fit too tight on his broad shoulders. "Hi, Axel," she replied with forced politeness, because she didn't want to create a scene, but also had no interest in talking to him. "You look beautiful as always." he said, moving closer than necessary, and Betty smelled the strong scent of whiskey on his breath mixed with expensive cologne. "Can I buy you a drink?" Betty was going to refuse, but then a strange and somewhat vindictive idea crossed her mind. Axel was one of Jaden's closest friends and had laughed along when he heard about the cruel invitation, and maybe using him to make Jaden feel something would be a small way to recover some of the power she'd lost in recent weeks. "Sure," she accepted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why not?" They went to the bar and Axel ordered 2 colorful cocktails that arrived in tall glasses decorated with fruit and paper umbrellas, and he kept talking about business and investments, while Betty pretended to be interested. She drank half the drink, feeling the alcohol burn gently in her throat and relax the tension in her shoulders a bit, and when Axel suggested they go to a quieter area of the club where they could talk better, she agreed without thinking much. The second drink appeared too quickly, and Betty didn't see exactly when Axel got it from the bar or where it came from, but he extended the glass to her with that smile that now seemed to have something different in his eyes. She took a few sips distracted while he talked about a recent trip to Dubai, and it was only when she finished half the second cocktail that she started to feel something strange happening. The room started spinning slowly, and the colored lights that before were just irritating now seemed to be moving in slow motion, leaving bright trails in the air, and Betty blinked several times trying to focus her vision, but everything remained blurry and distorted. The sounds around became muffled, as if she were underwater, and her legs began to shake in a way that had nothing to do with high heels. "So you okay?" Axel asked, but his voice sounded distant and strange. And when Betty tried to answer, her tongue was too heavy and the words came out jumbled and senseless. "I don't know. I feel weird," she managed to say as she leaned against the wall because the floor seemed to be tilting dangerously. "You drank too fast," Axel said, grabbing her arm tightly and guiding her away from the main area of the club. "Come on. There are some private rooms upstairs where you can rest a bit." Some distant and still functioning part of Betty's brain screamed that this was wrong and that she shouldn't go anywhere with him, but her body wasn't obeying commands, and she found herself being practically carried down a dark, narrow hallway that led to the club's second floor. Axel's steps echoed on the wooden floor, and Betty tried to pull her arm, but her strength had completely disappeared. "Wait, we need to go back," she murmured with a thick tongue and increasingly confused and disconnected thoughts. "Relax, you just need to lie down a bit," Axel replied, opening a door that led to a small room with a king-size bed, covered in white sheets and low reddish lighting. He gently pushed her inside and closed the door behind them with a click that sounded much louder than it should. Betty felt panic begin to grow through the chemical fog, clouding her mind, and she tried to walk toward the door, but her feet got tangled, and she almost fell to the floor. Axel held her by the waist and pulled her back with his hands moving to places they shouldn't be touching. And Betty tried to push him, but it was like trying to move a solid wall with hands made of cotton. "Stop, please stop," she begged, feeling tears start to run down her face as terror cut through the confusion. "You came with me because you wanted to," Axel said with his voice different now, darker and more dangerous. "Don't be dramatic." The door opened with such force that it hit the wall with a crash, and Jaden appeared in the doorway with an expression on his face that Betty had never seen before. His dark eyes were almost black with rage, and his hands were closed in fists so tight that his knuckles turned white, and he crossed the room in 3 long steps before Axel could even react. "Get your hands off her now," Jaden said with his voice so low and dangerous that the air in the room seemed to cool instantly. Axel let go of Betty so quickly that she stumbled to the side and would have fallen if Jaden hadn't caught her by the arm, keeping her upright. And then he turned all his attention to the man who had been his friend. "Man, it's not what you're thinking," Axel started to say, but Jaden cut him off with a punch so fast that Betty barely saw the movement. Axel fell backward, holding his nose that started bleeding, immediately staining his white shirt. And Jaden positioned himself between him and Betty, like a protective shield, impossible to get through. The fight that followed was quick and brutal, with Jaden blocking all of Axel's Pathetic attempts to fight back, until two security guards appeared and separated. The two men pulling Axel out of the room while he shouted apologies and accusations at the same time. "He's never coming back here," Jaden told the security guards with an authority that didn't allow questioning. "Never again. And if I find out he did this to anyone before, I'm going to sue this club and everyone involved." When the security guards took Axel away and the hallway finally fell silent, Jaden turned to Betty, who was trembling, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed over her chest. He took off his suit jacket and placed it over her shoulders, even in the club's warm atmosphere, and then held her face between his hands with a delicacy that contrasted completely with the violence he'd shown seconds before. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" Jaden asked with his voice still tense but infinitely softer now. Betty shook her head no, because the words wouldn't come out, but the tears kept falling silent and hot down her face, and Jaden pulled her into a tight hug where she finally allowed her body to shake completely. They stayed like that for several minutes until her breathing calmed down a bit and the world stopped spinning so violently. "Come on, I'm taking you home," Jaden said gently as he guided her out of the club, ignoring the curious looks from people who had seen the commotion. His car was a black SUV with beige leather interior, and he adjusted the passenger seat so Betty could recline a bit, and then drove in silence through the city's lit streets while she looked out the window, trying to process everything that had happened. The drug Axel had put in her drink was still taking effect, making everything somewhat unreal and distant. But Jaden's solid and reliable presence beside her was like an anchor, keeping her connected to reality. When they arrived at the building where Betty lived, Jaden turned off the engine and turned to look at her with an expression that mixed concern and something deeper that she couldn't name in the confused state she was in. "Can you walk by yourself, or do you want me to help you up?" he asked without any tone of judgment or impatience. Can you come up with me, please?" Betty asked with her voice small and vulnerable, because the idea of being alone at that moment was too terrifying. Jaden agreed immediately and helped her out of the car and walked to the elevator that took them to the 8th floor where the apartment was. Selah wasn't home because she'd gone to spend the weekend with friends, and Betty felt a mix of relief and fear as she opened the door and turned on the living room lights. "Do you want me to stay until you feel better?" Jaden offered, staying close to the door as if not wanting to invade her space without explicit permission. "Yes, please stay," Betty said, letting herself fall on the couch and finally taking off the shoes that had been hurting her feet for hours. Jaden sat on the other end of the couch, maintaining a respectful distance, and waited in silence while Betty wiped away the tears that still occasionally fell. The drug was starting to lose its effect, and mental clarity was slowly returning, bringing along all the shame and horror of what had almost happened. "I thought beauty would make everything easier," Betty finally said with her voice broken and her eyes fixed on her own hands. "I thought if I became beautiful, people would respect me, and I'd be happy, and everything would be easier. But I almost lost Rose because of it, almost lost the only true friendship I had." "Rose is still there," Jaden said gently. "True friendships survive mistakes if you have the courage to apologize. All I know how to talk about now is makeup," Betty continued, and there was a self-pity in her voice she hated but couldn't control. "My Instagram feed turned into a Barbie house full of edited photos, and the YouTube I watch is just tutorials on how to do perfect contouring. That's all I've become." Jaden let out a low and surprisingly gentle laugh that made Betty finally look directly at him, and there was something in his dark eyes that was different from everything she'd seen before in the months they'd worked together. "YouTube-only makeup tutorials? That's genuinely sad," he said with that sharp humor but without cruelty. "The Betty I've gotten to know through the reports you write is much more interesting than that. You have a way of analyzing numbers that's almost artistic, and I've always wanted to ask you where that skill comes from." Betty blinked in surprise, because in all the months working for him, Jaden had never shown he noticed anything beyond her appearance before or after the transformation, and hearing that he actually paid attention to her work was strangely comforting, in a way she didn't expect. "I studied math in college before switching to business administration," she replied, and for the first time in weeks felt like talking about something that didn't involve beauty products. I always liked finding patterns where other people only see random numbers. I knew it, Jaden said with a small smile. You can see it in your reports. You have a gift. They talked for more than an hour about work and college and books they liked and music they listened to. And it was the first real and genuine conversation they'd had since the transformation had begun. Betty realized she was laughing at jokes Jaden made and sharing opinions without, worrying if she was saying the right thing or looking beautiful enough. And the feeling of just being herself without all the layers of performance was liberating in a way she'd forgotten existed. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, Jaden finally got up from the couch and Betty walked him to the door feeling a deep gratitude that went far beyond simple words of thanks. Thank you, she said anyway, for everything, for saving me and for staying and for really talking to me. You don't need to thank me for doing the basic, decent thing as a human being, Jaden replied, and then hesitated for a second before continuing. And Betty, you're amazing exactly as you are, with or without makeup, with or without all this production. I hope you can see that at some point. He left the apartment, leaving Betty, standing there at the door processing his words and feeling something begin to change deep in her chest, where anger and pain had lived for so long. For the first time since she'd heard that cruel joke, she wondered if maybe the problem had never been her appearance, but rather the fact that she'd given the wrong people the power to define her worth, and maybe, just maybe, it was possible to get that power. Chapter 6. Balance and True Love.
For the first time, I'm finally becoming the real me.
The weekend following the incident with Axel passed in a contemplative fog where Betty spent most of her time in the apartment thinking about everything that had happened in recent weeks and trying to reorganize the broken pieces of the person she had become. Selah came back on Sunday night, and when she saw her sister sitting on the couch, without makeup and wearing just an old sweatshirt, she knew something fundamental had changed. Are you okay? Selah asked, sitting beside her and holding Betty's cold hand between hers. I don't know yet, Betty replied with raw honesty, but I think I'm starting to understand some things I refused to see before. Monday morning, Betty woke up without setting the alarm for 5:30 and for the first time in months allowed her body to rest until 7 o'clock, when the sun was already high, illuminating the room. She went to the bathroom and looked at her clean face in the mirror, seeing the slight dark circles in skin without foundation and naturally rosy lips. And instead of the repulsion she expected to feel, there was only an almost peaceful neutrality. She did a basic skincare routine with just 3 products, instead of the 7 she'd used religiously, and applied makeup so light it barely looked like she was wearing anything beyond concealer on her dark circles and mascara on her lashes. Her hair was pulled into a simple ponytail, without the elaborate waves that took 40 minutes to create. And when she got dressed, she chose comfortable clothes that fit well but weren't a complete production. At the office, some people looked with curiosity at the more casual version of Betty, but she ignored the looks and focused on the work that had piled up while she was distracted with superficial obsessions. The numbers on the spreadsheets made sense again, and she found that old pleasure of discovering patterns and optimizing processes. And when she finished a particularly complex report, she felt a genuine satisfaction that had nothing to do with appearance or external validation. At lunchtime, Betty was getting off the elevator when she saw Rose entering the cafe on the building's ground floor, and her heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. She hesitated for a second, thinking about turning back and avoiding the painful confrontation. But then she remembered Jaden's words about true friendships surviving mistakes, if there was courage to apologize. Rose, she called before she could lose her courage, and her friend turned with a cautious expression on her face. Can we talk, please? Rose looked at her for a long moment, evaluating the sincerity in the request, and then agreed with a silent nod. And they went to sit at a corner table, away from the other people having lunch. Betty felt her hands shake as she fidgeted with the paper napkin, but forced the words out before fear could paralyze her completely. I'm sorry, she began, and her voice came out choked right from the start. I'm sorry for everything I said at the party, and for pushing you away, and for becoming someone so superficial that I completely forgot the value of the people who really matter. Rose stayed silent, watching her with those brown eyes that had known Betty for so long, and then sighed deeply before responding. "Do you hurt me?" she said with painful simplicity. "You hurt me a lot when you said I never needed to prove anything. Do you think being naturally beautiful means my life is easy? That I don't have my own insecurities and struggles?" "I know," Betty replied, feeling tears begin to form. "I know, and it was horrible and selfish of me to say that. I was so lost in my own pain that I couldn't see anything beyond it. You almost lost yourself completely, Betty." Rose continued, but there was a softening in her tone that gave hope. "The person obsessed with blush and contouring wasn't my friend. My friend is the smart and funny woman who loves math and who cries watching bad movies and who has a huge heart when she lets people see it. Forgive me for almost losing our friendship," Betty said, and the tears finally fell as she extended her hand across the table. "You're the best person I know, and I was a complete idiot." Rose held her hand tightly, and a small smile finally appeared at the corner of her lips. "You really were," she agreed with that sharp humor Betty had missed so much. "But I also almost lost you, and that scared me more than any fight." They talked for more than an hour about everything that had happened since the transformation, and Betty told her about the incident with Axel and how Jaden had saved her and stayed talking until late. And Rose listened to everything with genuine attention without judgment. When they finally got up to go back to work, the hug they shared was tight and comforting in a way that made Betty realize how much she'd missed that true connection. On Wednesday afternoon, Jaden asked to speak with Betty privately, and they went to the empty conference room at the end of the hallway, where natural light came through the large windows, creating geometric patterns on the light wooden floor. He closed the door and stood still for a moment, as if organizing difficult thoughts, and Betty waited with her heart beating hard because she wasn't sure what to expect. "I need to apologize to you," Jaden finally began, and his voice had a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "A sincere apology without flimsy excuses for what I did." Betty was going to say it was okay, but he raised his hand, asking her to let him finish first. "I hate myself for not seeing your inner beauty before the transformation," he continued, and there was an intensity in his dark eyes that made the air feel denser. "I hate myself for being so superficial and cruel to the point of making that idiotic joke just to impress friends who clearly aren't worth anything. You taught me that I was blind and petty, and that I was living in a bubble of privilege where I only saw people by their external packaging. Jaden, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted, taking a step closer, and Betty felt her body temperature rise with the proximity. "You deserve to hear this, and I need to say it. Be yourself, Betty. Wear glasses if you like them. Wear makeup when you want to, or don't wear it when you don't want to. Wear clothes that make you feel good, regardless of whether they're designer or not. That's what will make me happy too, because what I want is the real Betty, not an edited version of her." The words hit Betty with a force that knocked the hair from her lungs, and she felt something move inside her chest, something that had been frozen since the night she heard that cruel conversation. Behind the door, Jaden was so close now that she could feel the heat emanating from his body and see the small color variations in his dark brown eyes. And when he raised his hand and touched her face with an almost reverent delicacy, she didn't pull away. "You're amazing exactly as you are," he said, with his voice low and intense. "And I'm an idiot who took too long to realize it." Betty felt tears form, but this time they were different from the tears of pain and humiliation she'd cried so many times in recent weeks. They were tears of relief and recognition, and something that looked dangerously like hope. "I don't know who I am yet," she admitted, with her voice trembling slightly. "I spent so much time trying to be what I thought everyone wanted me to be that I lost touch with the real person in the middle of all this." "Then find out," Jaden replied, and his thumb traced a soft line on her cheek, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "Find out in your own time and in your own way. And if you'll let me, I want to be here while you do it." The tension between them was almost tangible, and Betty felt her breathing become irregular when Jaden leaned slightly toward her, but then he stopped inches away, waiting for her to close the space if she wanted to, and she wanted to, she realized with surprising clarity, but she also knew she wasn't ready yet, because she needed to find herself before giving herself completely to someone. "I need time," she whispered, and saw immediate understanding in his eyes. "I have all the time in the world," Jaden replied, stepping back, but keeping his hand on her face for one more second before letting it fall. In the following weeks, Betty began a slow and deliberate process of discovering who she really was when all masks were removed and all external expectations were ignored. She went back to wearing her glasses from time to time, especially on weekends when she was home reading or watching movies, and discovered she liked the familiar feeling of their weight on her nose and the way they framed her face. Makeup became a conscious choice instead of an oppressive obligation, and she started doing lighter and more natural versions that enhanced without hiding, applying products only when she felt like it, and not because she thought she needed to in order to be accepted. Some days she left the house with just moisturizer and sunscreen and discovered that the world didn't end and people didn't stop respecting her professionally. The clothes were reorganized in the closet, and Betty donated the pieces that were beautiful but uncomfortable, or that simply didn't represent who she was, and kept only those that made her feel confident and authentic at the same time. Balance was hard to find, but each small step in the right direction brought a growing sense of freedom. The gym she'd started attending obsessively to maintain the perfect body was replaced by contemporary dance classes that she'd loved as a teenager, but abandoned when she started college. The feeling of moving freely through the room to the sound of instrumental music, without worrying if she was burning enough calories or toning the right muscles, was liberating in a way she didn't remember physical exercise could be. Rose became part of her routine again, with weekly lunches that lasted hours and text conversations about everything and nothing, and Betty realized how much she'd missed having someone she could be completely honest with without fear of judgment. Selah also visibly relaxed when she saw her sister finding a healthy balance between taking care of her appearance and not being consumed by it. Instagram continued to exist, but the photos were now less edited and more genuine, showing Betty in real moments of life instead of just perfect poses in idealized settings, and the followers who stayed were those who really cared about authentic content. YouTube went back to including other types of videos, besides makeup tutorials, and she rediscovered the pleasure of watching documentaries about math and science. Jaden kept his word and gave Betty space to find herself, but his presence was always there at the edges of her life in small and significant ways. He left coffee on her desk on difficult mornings and sent funny messages during particularly boring meetings, and when they met in the office hallways, the smile they shared had a growing intimacy that made her stomach flutter in a good way. 2 months after the incident with Axel, Betty was working late on a quarterly report when Jaden appeared in her office doorway with 2 cups of hot chocolate in his hands. She had gone back to working at her own desk instead of the executive reception. After finally accepting the promotion she'd refused during the superficial obsession phase. "Thought you could use this," he said, extending one of the cups and sitting in the chair across from her desk. Betty accepted the chocolate, feeling the pleasant warmth in her cold hands, and took a sip, savoring the rich and comforting flavor, and then looked at Jaden and noticed he was wearing those reading glasses he rarely used in public, and that made him look less intimidating and more human. "Thank you," she said with a genuine smile, "for everything, for giving me space and for not giving up even when I was completely lost." "You were never lost," Jaden replied with that characteristic intensity in his eyes. "You were just trying to find a path that made sense for you and not for others." They talked for more than an hour about work and life and future plans, while the office emptied around them. And when Jaden finally got up to leave, he hesitated near the door, looking at her with an expression that mixed hope and vulnerability. "That time you asked for," he began carefully. "Do you still need it, or—" Betty got up from her chair and walked to where he was standing, feeling her heart beat hard, but in an excited way instead of anxious. And when she got close enough to feel his warmth, she smiled with a confidence that came from a true place inside. "I think I've had enough time," she replied, and saw the smile spread across his face before the distance between them disappeared completely. The kiss was soft and slow and full of a promise of things yet to come, and when they finally separated, Betty realized that for the first time since the transformation had begun, She was completely present in the moment without worrying about how she looked or what people would think. "You're wearing your glasses," Jaden said when he stepped back enough to look at her, and there was something like admiration in his voice. "I am," Betty confirmed, touching the frames with a smile. "I decided I like them after all." "I like them too," he replied, and the sincerity in the statement made her heart melt a little more. In the following months, Betty and Jaden built a relationship based on authenticity and mutual respect, where she could be completely herself without masks or performances, and he learned to value substance over surface in ways that changed how he saw the entire world. They had deep conversations about math and business and future dreams, and spent weekends watching bad movies and cooking together and simply existing in each other's space without pressure. Betty continued wearing makeup when she felt like it and choosing clothes that made her feel beautiful. But now these choices came from a place of self-love, instead of desperate insecurity. She was beautiful because she chose to be, and not because she needed to be to have value. And that fundamental difference changed everything. Rose became friends with Jaden too, and the three often had lunch together, laughing at inside jokes and making plans for the future. And Betty looked at those moments with deep gratitude, because she had almost lost everything because of an empty obsession. Selah saw her sister happy and balanced and felt immense pride because she knew the true glow-up hadn't been the external transformation but rather the internal journey of rediscovery and acceptance. Miranda eventually left the company after several people witnessed the ice bucket incident and made formal complaints about harassment, and Betty felt only slight satisfaction knowing this, because revenge no longer mattered the same way it had before. On the one-year anniversary since that first disastrous party, Betty was sitting in the apartment she now shared with Jaden, looking at old photos of herself with thick glasses and shapeless clothes. She didn't feel shame or repulsion seeing those images, but rather a tenderness for the version of her that had suffered so much and fought so hard to find a place in the world. "You were beautiful there too," Jaden said over her shoulder, looking at the photos. "You just didn't know it yet." "I know now," Betty replied, turning to kiss him with that natural ease she'd developed. And that's what matters. She was beautiful now, not because she had radically changed on the outside, but because she had finally learned to see herself through the eyes of those who truly loved her, including herself. The beauty that mattered came from within and reflected outward in subtle but transformative ways. And Betty Gibbies had discovered that when you truly love yourself, the whole world lights up around you. And that was the true transformation that no amount of makeup or expensive clothes could ever buy.
Rowan's fun facts. The emerald green dress from Chapter 4 was specifically chosen to match Betty's eyes, but ended up being the outfit in which she suffered the greatest humiliation, symbolizing that external beauty doesn't protect from cruelty. Betty worked 3 years at Schultz Enterprises before the transformation, the same number of chapters it takes her to find balance, Chapters 4, 5, and 6. The pearls ripped off in Chapter 4, scattered across the marble floor, exactly like Betty's self-esteem fragmented, small pieces that needed to be gathered back together. Selah is 29 years old, 3 years older than Betty, and was always the mirror of what Betty thought she should be, until she discovered she could be herself. The first party dress, deep blue, Chapter 3, matched Jaden's tie, a detail Betty didn't notice at the time, but that symbolized an unconscious connection. Rose never had a last name mentioned in the chapters until Chapter 1, Martinez, representing that true friendships don't need formal labels to be valuable. Betty went from waking up at 5:30 a.m., Chapter 4, to 7:00 a.m., Chapter 6, gaining 1.5 hours of sleep that symbolizes recovering rest and inner peace. The number of skincare products decreased from 7 steps to 3 basic steps, reflecting the simplification of Betty's life. Jaden wore a navy blue suit in the first chapter and reading glasses only in the last I'd, showing that he also allowed himself to be more authentic. Miranda Frost has a last name that means frost, ice, perfectly representing her cold and destructive personality. Axel Bryant was kicked out of the club but never mentioned again after, symbolizing that toxic people simply disappear when you protect yourself. The hot chocolate Jaden brings in Chapter 6 contrasts with the champagne from the first party. Hot, comforting drink versus cold, superficial. Betty returned to contemporary dance that she loved as a teenager, showing that healing involves reconnecting with forgotten old passions. The apartment never had a specific address mentioned, only 8th floor, representing that physical place matters less than who's there. Betty's Instagram went from 200 to 5,000 followers, and then stabilized with those who really cared, quality over quantity. Vincent and Isabella, hairstylist and stylist, appear only in Chapter 2 and never return, showing that some people are just temporary catalysts for change. Jaden's jacket placed over Betty in Chapter 5 is the first gesture of genuine physical protection she receives in the entire story. Ugly Betty was said explicitly 4 times and never repeated again. The nickname loses power when you stop believing it. The kiss between Betty and Jaden happens exactly when she's wearing glasses again, proving he fell in love with the authentic version of her. And if you want to check out another story, click on the video that appears on the screen now.